Hey everyone, welcome back to Learn With Me. I'm Deborah Hanson, and today we're going to look at the key terms for 2.1 perception. And just like I did in Unit 1, I'm going to have two separate videos for each section of the unit. So the first video will be the CED questions with all the essential knowledge explained, and I'll go through details in that video. And then the second video that I'll do for 2.1 or 2.2 and 2.3, so on, will be the key terms for that particular section of the unit. And what I'll do is I'll give you a definition and an example for each of the words. And then at the end, I'll just go through the words so that you can check on your flashcards or your notebook or however you decide you want to keep track of these words. You do have to keep track of these words. This is really important for the test, whether it's flashcards in your notebook, whatever you decide to do, or you can use a digital platform like Quizlet where you're actually practicing the key terms for psychology, but you do somewhere have to write them down. And we just know that you're going to encode that information so much better if you write it down. So write it somewhere, okay? And then we'll go through each one by one, okay? So if you haven't listened to 2.1, the review yet, you might want to do that first because that'll give you the background information, and then you do the key terms, or some people like to do the key terms first and then do the actual review. Completely up to you. If you want to follow along with the full slideshow from the review section, I'll put the link right below to my Teacher Pay Teacher store where you can get the workbook and the slideshow that will help you really sort of absorb more of the information if you just want to write it all down, because I do, when I'm talking, it's a bit more difficult, but it's all on the slideshows for you, okay? If you like the content of the video, please like and subscribe. Really helps me a lot, and it kind of pushes me to do a little bit more. I am trying to get through all 5 units. So anyway, here we go. Thank you. Okay, so here we go. Key terms 2.1 perception for AP psychology. Okay, so these are all the key terms we're going to go through. I think there's about 27 of them. And like I said, in the other video, it really goes into more detail. This is strictly definition, example. Okay, the first word we're going to start with is perception. Great word to start with since the whole unit is called 2.1 perception. So let's go with perception and the definition of that. Perception is the process by which individuals organize and interpret their sensory impressions in order to give meaning to their environment. So essentially, it is how we see, understand, and interpret the world around us. Here's an example. Imagine you hear a song playing softly in the background. Your perception of this song might be influenced by your previous experience with that music or with music in general. If it's a song you dance to at your wedding, you might perceive it as a joyful and uplifting, even if it's a generally sad song. This differs from someone who has no personal experience or personal connection to that song, who might perceive it just based on its lyrics or melody alone. Next one, bottom-up processing. Bottom-up processing is when your brain makes sense of information starting with the small details and then putting it all together. It's like putting a puzzle together by starting with the individual pieces. So if you see a jigsaw puzzle piece, you notice its color and shape first. And as you find more pieces, you start connecting them all together and you begin to understand what the picture is going to build to, and up from those small details to the full image. By the way, I love doing puzzles. Okay, top-down processing. Top-down processing is when your brain uses previous knowledge and experiences to understand and interpret new information. It starts with the general idea, and then it applies it to the details. So imagine you walk into a room that smells like cinnamon. Because of your previous experiences, you might immediately think there are cinnamon buns baking, even before you see the kitchen. Your brain uses the familiar smell and applies what you already know to make sense of that sensory input. Schemas. Schemas are mental structures that help us organize and interpret information. They're based on our past experiences and knowledge, and they influence how we perceive new events and information that we're presented with. Imagine you're going to a birthday party. Based on your previous experiences, you have a schema that includes the expectations like there's going to be gifts, there's going to be a cake, there's probably going to be games. When you arrive and you see these elements, your schema confirms that it's a typical birthday party. If something unusual happens, like a magic show instead of games, it might take you a moment to adjust your schema of what a birthday party can include. Perceptual sets. Perceptual sets are mental tendencies and expectations that shape the way we perceive our environment. They're influenced by our past experiences, our culture, our emotions, motivation that guides us to see what we expect to see. If you're told to watch out for a person in a red shirt in a crowded room, your perceptual set will focus your attention on red shirts. As a result, you might quickly spot people wearing red shirts while potentially overlooking other important details, like someone waving at you from the other side of the room. Your expectations have set you up to perceive the environment in a specific way. Gestalt principles. The Gestalt principles are rules that describe how we visually perceive objects as whole forms rather than just a collection of simple parts. These principles suggest that our brain are wired to organize and make sense of complexity by forming structured wholes, sorry. One of the Gestalt principles is the principle of closure. This occurs when we see incomplete shapes or patterns but still perceive them as complete. For example, if you see a broken circle where only parts of the lines are drawn, your mind just naturally fills in the gaps, and you still recognize it as a circle. This principle shows how our visual perception tends to complete unfinished objects to form a coherent whole. Closure. Closure is a psychological principle within the Gestalt principles of perception, where the mind fills in the gaps to create a complete whole object. That was the example in the last one, right? This happens even if the object itself is incomplete or missing information. So consider a scenario where you see a partially obscured letter or graphic, such as a company's logo. It's partially hidden, for example, behind a pillar. Even though you can't see the whole logo, your mind automatically fills in the missing parts, allowing you to recognize the logo based on the invisible segments. This demonstrates how our perception uses closure to complete the image. Figure ground. Figure ground perception is a type of visual perception in which the viewer automatically separates elements of a visual scene into a figure, that's your focal object, and the ground, the background, to make sense of what they see. This helps in identifying objects in complex arrangements. A common example is the Rubin vase, and you can see it right here. So it represents a visual form that we can perceive either as a vase, the figure, on the black background, the ground, or as two faces looking at each other, the figures, within the white space forming the background, the ground. This demonstrates how your perception can shift between seeing the figure and the ground depending on how you focus. Proximity. Proximity is a Gestalt principle of perceptual organization that describes how objects that are close to each other tend to be perceived as a group or pattern. This principle suggests that elements located near one another are visually associated, influencing how we organize and interpret scenes. So, for example, imagine several dots on a piece of paper. If the dots are randomly scattered, they appear as individual elements. However, if the dots are grouped closely together in clusters, you naturally perceive them as part of a distinct group. This organization happens even though the only thing changing in the distance between the dots, demonstrating how proximity affects our perception of grouping. Similarity. Similarity is a principle of Gestalt psychology that states individuals tend to perceive elements as grouped together if they look similar to each other. This perceptual grouping can occur based on attributes like color, shape, size, or orientation. Consider a display of shirts in a store arranged by color. All the red shirts are grouped together, followed by groups of blue shirts, green shirts, etc. When you look at the display, you naturally see these groups based on the similarity in color, making it easier to navigate the choices based on your color preference. This example demonstrates how similarity helps us organize visual information efficiently by grouping the items together. Common fate. Common fate is a Gestalt principle of perceptual organization that suggests elements moving in the same direction or at the same rate are perceived as part of a single group or unit. This principle reflects how motion can influence visual grouping. Consider a group of birds flying together in the sky. Even if the birds are spread out, as long as they all move cohesively in one direction, you perceive them as a flock. This grouping happens because their shared motion, their common fate, binds them visually, making them appear as one cohesive unit. Selective attention. Selective attention is the process by which a person focuses on one particular stimulus or task while ignoring other stimuli. This cognitive process allows individuals to concentrate on important details by filtering out less relevant or distracting information. So imagine you're in a busy cafe trying to read a book. Despite the surrounding noise, the chatter of people, the clicking of cups, the background noise, you manage to focus solely on the text of your book. Your ability to tune out the environmental noise and concentrate on reading exemplifies your selective attention, as you selectively focus your awareness on the book while ignoring the other stimuli. Inattentional blindness. Inattentional blindness is when a person fails to see an unexpected object in plain sight because their attention is focused on another task. This occurs because the brain's focus is so concentrated that it blocks out any other stimuli. In the invisible gorilla study, which I think we talked about in the other video, there's a very famous video that demonstrates this particular concept in psychology, where the kids are playing basketball and there's a gorilla and you get to see it. You probably saw it in class anyway. So in the invisible gorilla study, participants watching a video and counting basketball passes failed to notice a person in a gorilla suit walking through the scene. This illustrates how focused attention can lead to missing other obvious elements. The cocktail party effect. The cocktail party effect is a phenomenon where a person can focus their auditory attention on a particular stimulus while filtering out a range of other stimuli, much as a partygoer can focus on a single conversation in a noisy room. At a busy cafe, if you're engaged in a deep conversation with a friend, despite the background noise of the coffee machines, the other patrons talking, music playing, you're able to concentrate solely on your friend's words and respond appropriately, demonstrating the cocktail party effect. We talked about this a little bit also when we talked in the review, where even something, if you're talking to somebody at a party and you are very focused on that person, but you hear your name and you can actually pinpoint that you've heard your name in the distance, that's also an example of the cocktail party effect. Retinal disparity. Retinal disparity refers to the slight difference in the visual information that reaches each eye because of their horizontal separation. The brain uses these differences to calculate depth, allowing us to perceive the worlds in 3 dimensions. The world, not worlds, we only have one, right? When you hold a finger up in front of your face and close one eye, then you switch and close to the other, you'll notice your finger appears to jump from one side to the other. Go ahead and try that. This movement is due to the different images each eye perceives and the brain's interpretation of these differences to gauge the depth, demonstrating retinal disparity. Convergence. Convergence is a binocular cue for perceiving depth, involving the inward turning of the eyes towards each other to focus on a nearby object. This muscle movement increases with the closeness of the object, helping the brain gauge the distance. When you hold a pencil close to your nose and you focus on its tip, your eyes naturally move inward towards each other to maintain focus on the pencil. The greater the inward turn, the closer the object is perceived to be. This is your brain using convergence to determine how near the pencil is to your face. Relative clarity. Relative clarity is a binocular cue in perception that helps us determine depth based on the clarity of objects. Objects that are closer appear sharper and more detailed, whereas objects that are farther away appear fuzzier and less defined. When looking at a landscape, mountains in the distance may appear hazy and less distinct compared to the trees and objects that are closer to you. They may have a sharper, clearer detail. This difference in clarity helps your brain perceive the relative distance between these objects. Relative size. Relative size is a monocular cue in visual perception where the brain uses the size of the objects in comparison to other objects in the same visual field to judge the relative distance. Objects that appear larger are perceived to be closer, while those that are smaller are farther away. If you see 2 cars of the same model on a road, but one car looks smaller than the other, you automatically perceive the smaller car as being farther away from you. This perception occurs even though you know the cars are the same size, illustrating how relative size helps us determine distance. Texture gradient. Texture gradient is a monocular cue for depth perception where objects closer to the viewer have a coarser, more distinct texture, while those further away appear smoother and less detailed. This cue helps the brain determine how far away the objects are based on changes in texture. So when looking at a gravel path stretching into the distance, the gravel near your feet appears rough and maybe visual. You can see the individual stones clearly and distinguishable. As the path extends away from you, the texture of the gravel becomes progressively smoother, less distinct. This gradual change in texture helps you perceive the path, the depth, and the distance of that path. Linear perspective. Linear perspective is a monocular cue for depth perception that involves parallel lines converging in the distance at a single point, known as the vanishing point. This visual phenomenon suggests that depth and distance allowing the brain to perceive the relative size and position of objects in space. So when you look at a straight road stretching into the horizon, the sides of the road appear to converge towards a point in the distance. Even though you know the road remains the same width, this convergence at the vanishing point helps your brain perceive that the road as extending far into the distance. Interposition. Interposition, also known as occlusion, is a monocular cue in visual perception where one object partially covers another, suggesting that the covering object is closer to the viewer. This cue helps us understand depth and the relative positioning of objects in space. Imagine sitting in a park bench and watching a bird fly behind the tree. You can't see the bird fully because the tree blocks your view of it at that certain moment. But the fact that the tree occludes your view of the bird allows your brain to perceive that the tree is closer to you than the bird. Size constancy. Size constancy is a perceptual stability mechanism by which we perceive objects as having a constant size, despite the variations in distance from which we view them. This means that our perceptions of size of objects are relatively constant even when our distance from them changes. Consider observing a car driving away from you. Even as the car gets further away and the image of the car on your retina becomes smaller, you do not perceive the car as actually shrinking. Instead, you understand that it maintains a constant size but appears smaller due to the increased distance. This ability to perceive the car as the same size no matter how far away it is exemplifies size constancy. Color constancy. Color constancy is a feature of the human color perception, the human color perception system, which ensures that the perceived color of objects remains relatively constant under varying illumination conditions, so different lighting conditions. This means that even when the lighting changes, the colors of objects are perceived to be the same as they would under normal lighting. So imagine wearing a blue shirt during a sunny day outside, then going indoors under artificial yellow lighting. Despite the significant change in lighting conditions, the shirt will still appear blue to you. This is because your visual system adjusts for the differences in lighting and maintains the perception of the shirt's color as blue, demonstrating color constancy. The phi phenomenon. The phi phenomenon is a visual illusion that involves the perception of motion created when when static images are displayed in rapid succession rather than actually moving. This principle is the basis for motion pictures, where a sequence of still images appear to be moving due to this perceptual phenomenon. Consider a string of lights along a billboard, where the lights turn on and off sequentially in such a way that it appears as if the light is traveling along the string. Although each light bulb lights up independently without moving, your visual system interprets the sequence as a smooth movement from one end to the other, demonstrating the phi phenomenon. Stroboscopic movement. I always have a hard time with that one. I have to really think about it before I say it. Stroboscopic movement is a visual phenomenon where rapid sequences of still images or frames create the illusion of smooth, continuous motion. This effect is based on the brain's ability to fill in the gaps between images when they're shown in quick succession. A classic example of stroboscopic movement is seen in flip books, where a series of drawings in slightly different positions are flipped through rapidly. We probably did these in elementary school, or maybe you still do them now. I always think they're really fun. Despite each page being static, when the pages are flipped quickly, it appears as though the drawing is moving or animating, simulating motion. This illustrates how the brain perceives motion from a sequence of static images. Okay, so now we're just going to go through each word. You can pause the video. So I would say when you see the word, pause the video and see if you can remember the definition and maybe the example that goes with each one. You can try doing it with your notes at first and then after maybe without your notes, because you do need to know these when you get to the AP exam so that you can apply them in any situation, whether it's an MCQ or an FRQ. Okay, here we go. Perception. Bottom-up processing. Top-down processing. Schema. Perceptual sets. Gestalt principles. Closure. Figure ground. Proximity. Similarity. Common fate. Selective attention. Inattentional blindness. Cocktail party effect. retinal disparity, convergence, relative clarity, relative size, texture gradient, linear perspective, interposition, size constancy, color constancy, phi phenomenon, stroboscopic movement. So those are the key terms for 2.1 that I think are important that you need to know for the AP exam. So please leave me a comment to see if you actually like the way I'm doing these, where I do the review in one and the key terms in another video. Because I mean, I think it would be helpful, and some of my students have said that, but I would really like to hear from you too if you find this helpful that I've separated the 2.1 into information and key terms. Anyway, if you like this video, please like and subscribe. It really helps me a lot. Thank you so much. It encourages me to keep going. And I really think it's fun to do them. So thanks a lot and see you next time.